So we're just finishing up this one section on making requests and pretending to be a developer. And I realize that I've sort of just thrown you into the wolves here if this is all new and you're like, he hasn't explained half of what these things are. It's okay. My philosophy is that you need some kind of concrete context so that when we go back in and lay in more of the abstract explanations, you have something to hang it on. So if you're kind of thinking, I'm going too fast, I haven't explained these, we will slow down and go meticulously through each of these components in a more conceptual level. And I don't know, it's just kind of my approach and how I like to try to make things hands-on. But I have one more activity because if you remember, our goal for this was to have this little widget that says, what's the weather, and get the weather and print it to the page. Well, to do that, we have to do a little bit more work. We have to implement something else. There's a very handy feature that is built into most browsers, Chrome, Firefox, and it's called the console. And when you go to a page, you may not see anything happening on this page, but if you open up the developer console, view, developer, you can do this or not, it doesn't matter. Probably just skip this for a minute. JavaScript console, you can see certain things get logged to the page. You can see the request logged to the page. This is also really helpful as you're testing things out. Just be aware of this because in your code you can easily add this little console note and then it puts it there, and you can see if what you're getting is really what should be returned. The way developers use this is once this object is returned to the page, they're able to access any of this information. For example, this information about the wind that appears here. They access this through something called dot notation, JSON dot notation. And this is the reason why, sorry, did I say JSON dot notation? JavaScript dot notation. This is the reason why people like JSON as the response format instead of XML. Because when you have this JSON block, you can use JavaScript to easily access parts of the response. This dot notation, basically in JavaScript, when you put dot after one of these key values, you access its value. So if I wanted to access wind speed, for example, I would do wind.speed and then it would give me this value. And this whole thing I've labeled response. You kind of choose what you want that to be. But it makes it very easy. Now, people may have applications that aren't JavaScript based. They may have Java applications. In that case, the code would be totally different. But for the most part, for web applications, you're going to see JavaScript and code that is going to access these values. So if we want to print this information about the wind speed to the page, we need a little bit of JavaScript. If I were to, now here I want you to build something kind of resembling this page, all right? This is activity 2E. It's a final activity we're doing in this developer section. And it's going to be the most challenging, so we'll see if you're able to do it or not. Let me collapse that. Why don't we just follow along, and I'll try to make it easier. If some of you who are maybe more developer-ish are probably just thinking this is such easy cakewalk stuff, but others may be like, too fast. It's always hit and miss. You need boilerplate HTML. So go ahead and use your favorite text editor. I like Sublime Text, whatever. And copy this little boilerplate thing. All this is HTML with a reference to jQuery so that we can use some jQuery AJAX.
You can copy that from the website?
Yep. Expand 2E and just copy that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay? And then save your file and call it whatever you want. Call mine weather123, just put it somewhere where you know where it is. All right, so do that. This will be pretty exciting if we get this If we get 80% of the people to have this be successful, I will consider that awesome. Okay, next, open Postman. Remember how before you copied the curl code? Now we're working in JavaScript or HTML. So copy the one that says JavaScript jQuery AJAX. We're going to use a method from jQuery to call and retrieve the information. This is going to look like this. So copy this guy, JavaScript jQuery AJAX, right there. If you forgot how to access this, it's right here. You click code down there. JavaScript jQuery. Okay, so you copy that.
jQuery AJAX.
Yep. Okay, now back in your code, add a pair of script tags in the header, just like empty script tags, because you have to put JavaScript inside script tags, right? And paste your code snippet inside of there, right? So add some empty script tags, script opening and closing tags, just like any kind of JavaScript would go inside of, and paste that thing in there.
Anywhere, did you say? Does it matter where?
Just below the jQuery one.
Oh, below.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't really matter as long as it's after the jQuery one, because AJAX is using a function from jQuery, so if jQuery is not called, it won't work. All right, now, if you're following along here in the steps as well, step number 7, remove this headers stuff that Postman is inserting for some reason, this headers object. Otherwise, it messes it up. So let's see what I've got highlighted there.
And the comma.
And the comma, yeah, and the comma. Otherwise, it'll be invalid JSON. So that, okay.
Yeah, that's where
I couldn't find it either.
Which one is 2E under?
It's
2E is in part 2.
Yeah, I know it's in part 2, but
it's inspect the JSON.
inspect the JSON. Okay, I checked the other JSONs. Where did you get that?
Okay, we're on step number 8. So if you, whoops, if you still have the comma after get, method get, remove that little comma. JSON doesn't have a comma after the last item. All right, so your final code should look like that. And now if you do number 9, start Chrome and open the JavaScript console. Well, presumably you've saved this, right? But start Chrome. You open the JavaScript console by going to View, Developer, JavaScript console. And then open up your page that you saved. Just go to File, Open. And you should see the little object returned, if it worked. So you can see, you can inspect this payload, as it's called, and you can see all the kind of information that is now available to you. I think I called the forecast one instead. I may have pasted the wrong thing in here.
Now, what if I don't have a view in my Chrome? Say,
It's developer tools. So if you right click in the window and hit inspect or Control Shift I.
inspect.
Click there and then
And then
should be more tools, I think.
There we go. extensions, developer tools. There we go. Ah, there we go.
They all work a little different.
Yeah.
Sorry, I had the wrong call pasted in. Okay, so tell me if you're able to get an object returned in your console. Raise your hand if you're successful at this. About 30%. Okay, let me go around and see. Anybody running into errors that they're like, what's going on?
Is that posted?
So that.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
Otherwise it doesn't work.
It's just not a guesser.
Well, it may be a guess or guess wrong.
I did, but I got an error on the second one. I mean, it worked
Oh, yeah?
once and then, yeah.
Okay.
No. So 31%.
Okay, there's one more step that we want to do to try to get, this is just logging this response to the page. And the reason it's doing that, up here where we have console log and response, essentially what this is doing is this. AJAX is executing the information contained in this settings variable. It's going out, it's getting this response, and it's passing the response into this little parameter here. And then what we decide to do, all this information is now contained in the response. Console.log just puts it in the console, so it prints it into the console. But we want to actually get information from that response. So there's one more step to do that. Back in the workshop activities, step number 11. Copy the little red code, and you're going to put that below console.log response in your code. This is going to get the wind speed using dot notation. So we're going to define a variable called content, access the wind speed, and we're going to append it to a little div tag called wind speed in number 12. So copy the in number 12, just put the little div tag there, and now save it, return to your page. Sorry, I'm going fast. 11 and 12, refresh your page, and you should have the wind speed. All right, so I'll give you a few minutes to try to make that work, and I'll go around and help people if they want. If you can't get it, it's okay. This is like just an example of following this through to the end of how to implement. Yep.
Okay, so I have Chrome open here. Let's go to File, Open File. But I don't seem to have the menus.
File, load resource, net error failed.
Mine's wrong. That showed up as soon as I opened it. I don't know what that is.
Oh, now go ahead and open the file that you've got your code in. Like,
The text file?
yeah, like no, from within Chrome, go to File, Open. Maybe just Commando or something, and then
No.
how do you get the toolbar in Chrome? Are you in full view or something?
Oh,
Is
that's
there-
when I did.
Yeah,
what was
console.
it? Console. Yeah. Oh, I right.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
is there? Where's
I
the?
right click and was it inspect? Or, yeah.
No, but like your file menu.
Yeah,
like
that's
if
what I'm looking for. Because
Doesn't
I never use
exist in
Chrome.
If
Windows
you,
Chrome.
what,
Oh, it doesn't.
No. But what are you trying to do, Tom?
just open the file, the HTML file.
So wherever you saved it, you can just open it from your.
Yeah,
File
if you use
Explorer.
Firefox, you like Firefox, you can
I
use
use
that.
Firefox,
Yeah, go ahead,
yeah.
go ahead and do that.
Oh, I can use that too?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it's
Although it, menu,
there we go. Open file.
open file, there we go.
It's Control O in there. I don't know.
It is control, look at that. So I just open up an HTML file.
Yeah. Then the developer tools menu in Firefox is similar. I think you is it a go to view, click there. Is there like developer tools?
Web developer,
Yeah, there we go. Web developer, web console.
web console.
And yeah, there you got the object. You can expand it and so forth. Yep. It looks highly similar. So, good.
Thank you.
Anybody else want me to come and try to look and see?
So showing gibberish.
Oh, let's take a look at it. What's your... Oh, you've got stuff pasted after your HTML. This script tag needs to go inside the head.
Yeah, I missed that. Thank you.
Okay.
The in Chrome is the so is the
Kind of question.
yeah it was.
Oh yeah.
Is this the console you're talking about?
Yeah. I just have mine at the bottom, but yeah. And but now open your file. Open your go to however you open a file and
Yeah, I don't know how, to be honest, I don't even know how to do that. I was gonna drag.
Yeah, what I did was I just copied it from the where the file was
Oh, just pasted it.
and pasted it in there.
honestly, where do they hide their toolbar? Why don't
I don't know. There's no open anymore. I don't know.
it's Control O? Does that just get you to it?
Elements has the HTML, no? I mean, console just gives me messages, but Elements shows me the page, HTML. I think.
Oh, so you just dragged your file over into it?
That's
Okay.
what I-
Yeah, try that.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna.
For some reason, I have my menu, and this actually happens where people are like, "There's no menu in Chrome," and it always throws me for a loop. I guess yeah. Hey, if you're in Windows and you don't see your Chrome menu that says File, Edit, View, how do you get that to appear? No. Okay.
Hit the Alt key, it should make it open.
Alt key? Try hitting the Alt key.
Hey, I think my file might be wrong. I
Okay.
was trying to listen to you and read at the same time, and I think I might have deleted something.
No, delete the headers object there, that
there
one.
we go.
Yeah.
Can I just grab this whole line?
And its cache control postman token thing,
this
everything that's
whole-
no. Yeah. Sorry, I thought you grabbed one extra curly brace there. Not the second one. Yeah.
Okay. This guy.
Yeah. Save it and try that.
Great. Thank you.
Cool stand. I like your laptop stand. Okay, this was probably the most challenging technical activity, at least that I've got. So if you made it work, awesome. If you didn't, you hopefully get the workflow of how a developer might use an API. You basically made a request out to some server. You've used JavaScript to actually send the request because that's the language of our application. We get the response back and we're doing something with it. That's really the heart of how developers use APIs. So let me just see how many people got like a response in a successful way. About half? Okay. Half or more? Not bad. Any questions, thoughts? Yeah, Bridget.
You go to the developer view in Chrome and open the file you made, and it's blank?
It's blank, but do you get a little thing down here at the bottom? Do you get an object log to it? See where my cursor's pointing right there?
No.
You see an object in the console? Let me take a look, because I was looking at your code there, and it looked good. Oh, hit refresh, like Command R, right there. And no, you don't. Can you just open up your code again?
You don't have the sample page. That letter. I removed the comma, I removed the header. Oh, maybe this is out of order, maybe?
I do not know what. Oh. Yeah, I think it is out of order. You've got a head enclosing everything. So go ahead and take this head tag right here and move that back up to after head. Save that and see if that works.
Okay, thanks.
And it did not work. All right. Well, what you can try to do is go back to the workshop activity, copy the final code. workshop
I'm not even
activities.
able to get this, I mean, I started
Thank you.
with developer,
Two,
not following what he said, just doing this.
and the very last code block. Copy that guy.
This guy.
See if see if
And
that'll
put
work.
my,
Oh, you go to that page.
my
Yeah.
file name in.
Page.
Uh,
You mean this sample, this page?
You can if you want, or you can just hit save.
Oh, it's over
For
here.
the sake of time, there, just hit save.
Open that file, like, where do you save it? You save it in your desktop or something? I saved it in a folder.
So open this guy, see if,
It'll open it in your browser. Oh, really? HTML extension. So you're editing a web page. Right. You actually have to launch it as a web page.
there you go. So now you're getting something you can expand there. I don't know what was wrong. We had probably some small thing, but okay.
Will it reach?
Yeah, but I don't think it's gonna reach.
All right, any questions before we move on to the next section? You guys are all probably ready to jump into more conceptual stuff, and that's exactly where we're headed. So we had some hands-on, you've got experience now, and we're moving into part 3, documenting API endpoints. This is what you'll need to know in order to document things.
Okay, that might work.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, if you're still having trouble, I can help you.
I'm happy to see Winspeed.
To see Winspeed. My first job was actually for a gamification company, and everything was JavaScript based, and so it was really kind of cool to be able to make little tiny widgets plugging in these things. And anyway, JavaScript's fun because it's like you just launch a browser and it works. Whereas if you had like a Java implementation, you'd have to have a Java IDE, and then you'd have to compile it, and it'd just be way more hassle than it's worth. So now, when you're documenting the reference part of an API, there are at least five sections that are core, that you really have to make sure they have all of these in there. And if they're missing some, then it's kind of like incomplete documentation. You have the resource description, you have the endpoints and methods, the parameters, the sample request, a sample response, and the response schema. We're going to dive into each of these. The resource. Resources refer to the information returned by the API. You were asking earlier, what's an endpoint? Where an endpoint is what accesses the resource. This could be, it's whatever information your API contains that people are trying to get to. People have a lot of different names for this. There's no standard, and this is where, if you're reviewing API documentation, you will see people call the endpoints API calls, methods, calls, resources, objects, services, requests. They might not call them anything. There's unfortunately no standard in terms of how people refer to all of these core things in an API that have these different paths where they get information. I mean, even the term resource is not standard. People might call it, backtrack. In addition to endpoints being varied, the thing that they're trying to access might be called resource or any of these as well. Here's an example from MailChimp. Oh, let me increase the size a little bit. Generally, in your resource, you want to have like a short 1 to 3 sentence description of what the information contains. This is the campaigns endpoint or campaigns resource in MailChimp, and they say campaigns are how you send your emails to your list, use campaign to manage and so forth in your account. It's just like a few sentences. Here's an example from Box. They have a membership object, they call it, and they have a short description at the top. Membership is used to signify that a user is part of a group, blah, blah, blah. Now this membership object has various methods: get membership, create membership, update membership, delete. But they all are doing something with membership, and so you've got to have some kind of description, right? This is not any kind of rocket science. Most things have a description. Here's an example from Eventbrite. Here, instead of having an overall description of what an event is, they chose to put their descriptions for each of the methods that you're working with events. So here, it's like the event /search method lets you retrieve a paginated response of event objects and so forth. So that is the first thing, is you describe the resource. Now, keep in mind that in reference docs, they tend to be brief. You might have a lot to say about something, but in the reference part of your documentation, you would just maintain your brevity and link out to more explanations in a tutorial or other user guide. All right, your second big, I don't have a ton to say about the resource description. The second big part is the endpoints and methods, right? So we have this resource, remember one said membership, but we have lots of different ways to access the information contained in that resource. And these are where the endpoints come in. The endpoints indicate how you access the resource, and they usually include the method that you use with this endpoint. The method specifies the sort of action you're doing. Are you reading it? Are you creating something new? Are you updating something? Are you deleting it? That's what we mean by method. And different endpoints correspond to different methods. So here's an example from Instagram. They've got this is some kind of users resource or relationships resource. And although it looks kind of like users. Anyway, you've got the method to the left. That's how they styled it. This is a get method. And then here is the endpoint. I like the word endpoint. I feel like people understand what that means, but you might have a different choice of terminology. Here's an example from, I think this is Facebook, yeah, Graph API. Whoa. Yeah. So the endpoint, now this endpoint has a path parameter in it. It's actually part of the endpoint. So it's kind of defined when the endpoint is defined. And usually people like to put the path parameters that are part of an endpoint in a different font so that they're recognized and people don't think, oh, am I really supposed to type a curly brace in this? Usually people put the method to the left of the endpoint, however you want to style it. You don't have to. Like here it says post and put and so forth. But you basically list the method beside each of the endpoint in some attractive way. Now, how exactly do you refer to each of these endpoints? This is where it gets really tricky, because let's say you have these two endpoints, users/user ID, rewards/mission ID. This is some kind of game API where you've got a reward that correlates to a certain mission and so forth, and that's how it gets returned. But then you might also have a missions endpoint that has certain rewards that correlate to that mission and so forth. How do you refer to these when you write documentation? Do you say, in order to get the available rewards for this mission, you're going to call the user/user ID/reward/mission endpoint? Or do you have a pet name for this and just call it the mission ID endpoint? It can be kind of tricky, and there's no sort of standard way that people refer to all these endpoints. Hopefully, there's a general resource that you could just refer to users to say, hey, this rewards or membership or mission resource or endpoint is called in the following way. Anyway, I just add this in here because when you're writing about this, it gets to be hard to refer to them. Okay, 3, parameters. These are options that you can pass with the endpoint, such as specifying the response format or the amount returned to influence the response. This is probably the most important part of the endpoint documentation because users need to know this detail, right? There are 4 types of parameters. There's a header parameter. This is passed in the header of the request. path parameter is actually added within the endpoint itself. It's part of it. And then the query string parameters are added after that. I have examples coming up here. And then request body parameters. So here's a sample header parameter. This would just be passed in the way that the information is sent. In Postman, if you're sending this, let me just open that up while I have it. You'll find that we didn't use this because our API didn't require it, but there's a headers tab right here. So if I had a parameter to send in the header of the request, I would put it there and it would send it. And curl, if I had curl, I would put it after like a -h. You'd have to just check the format, you know. But that's a lot of times how API keys are passed is in the header. I think it's just more secure that way. Yes?
Because it doesn't show up in the URL, is that why?
Probably, but yeah.
Do you typically document standard header parameters like content?
Oh.
Put in what, or you just...
You know, I think unless it's an unusual sort of parameter that's a non-default parameter, then you wouldn't need to. But yeah.
What about if in terms of supporting JSON and XML, I mean, some don't support both, right? So
yeah,
how would you...
It's a good point. So yeah, in the header, if you specified a certain content type because you wanted an XML response instead of JSON, you know, that might be something that you document. It depends on the API. Like, does the API have that as a configurable parameter? You know, that's what I would want to know, right?
If it supports both, it supports one.
That's a good thing to check, right? Maybe developers wouldn't even think to note that if they're jotting down notes about it, you know. But yeah, there could be parameters around that. This is the main thing I really wanted to communicate here. This path parameter, this is required, and the order matters in this one. The sample bicycles endpoint or whatever. But and usually just put this inside of curly braces. But a query string parameter comes after the question mark, and the order doesn't matter, and they're just concatenated with ampersands.
Does this order matter because of the way the JSON, the underlying implementation is written?
Well, with the path parameter, I don't know, the order just matters because, yeah, the way the code is written, they usually expect it to be there. But the query string parameters are any order is fine. I'm not really sure why code-wise, but that's just kind of how it is. The request body parameter is usually its own thing. And this is really quite common when you're creating a resource that you would send a request body parameter that would have a lot of different key value pairs. One company I worked with had, you could set up and configure a whole service, and it required a request body parameter that was hundreds of lines long. It was an absolute nightmare. But apparently you pass that request body parameter and you configure a whole server and so forth with just what you want. When you have a really long request body parameter, you would probably, like if you were submitting this through curl, you would store this in a file and reference that file in the curl command. Yeah, in Postman, you see there's a, let's see, there's a body param. Not really sure why that's not there.
Because you're doing a get.
Oh, look at you. You're getting to be very handy. Okay. Hey, yes, so you have a post, and now the body becomes available, and you can put a bunch of key value pairs here and send it. Postman is nice because you don't really have to worry about the format of your request. It's just kind of like you've got an interface to select these things, and it prompts you through it. And you can even specify some other details around it. Yeah, okay.
Another question, what would be the rationale for putting something in a body parameter as opposed to a command parameter?
As opposed to a command parameter?
As opposed to your URL?
Well, it's hard to pass JSON through a URL. Like you could minify this. Like
but I could put dates and equals 2, right?
There's a
no
line like the shoe.
Is that what?
The URL.
But, I mean, that wouldn't exceed the line length.
Yeah, this is so short it probably wouldn't make a huge difference,
I
but
just wondered if there was some general understanding of saying, well, if you're going to do this, you put it in a body parameter. If you're going to do this, you pass it.
there's I mean, as Dan was saying, the line length is probably one technical reason, but I think convention is when you're creating resources and you have a bunch of key value pairs that you're passing, that it just becomes a request body parameter, because it's just a lot easier. I mean, if I had to, every time I wanted to pass this in a curl command or something to minify this and to make it like URL safe, it'd be a pain.
Legibility and all those fun things too.
But the parameters are important because this is really what you're looking for each endpoint. You want to know what are the parameters, and having a clear idea that there are 4 types of parameters is a really good way to organize this. And these 4 types come from the Open API spec, which we'll talk about later, but it classifies these parameters into these 4 types. Your header parameters, path parameters, query string parameters, and request body parameters. That would be what information you would ask from the engineers to provide. And never trust them, by the way. If they say, yes, it takes this parameter, is this an integer or is this a string? You would want to try it out and try to break it and see if it's really the case. That's why testing in Postman is essential, because they will often forget things. But there are generally 4 or 5 different data types that parameters have. REST APIs don't tend to be as descriptive in the data types as Java. Java gets much more detailed because it allocates memory based on how big the number is. But with REST APIs, something is a string, like alphanumeric character string, an integer, a whole number, a Boolean, this is true or false, an object, this is a key value pair, or an array. And it's important to note this potentially. They might just all be strings and integers and might not be that essential, but this is also something you want to cover. Okay, this is what I was talking about earlier. I guess I also have a slide for this, but keep in mind the query, this is a path parameter here in my example because it comes before the question mark. After the question mark, you have query string parameters and their order is not important. So anything before that, the order is important. These would be totally different. You couldn't just swap this order. I've sort of hammered that home already.
Tom, can you
yeah.
tell us the difference between a query string parameter and a request body parameter?
Yeah. Just so like the difference in terms of like what they are. Let's say that I mean, it depends how people want to create their APIs, and this is where you're going to get a lot of variation. Sometimes developers prefer, for whatever design reasons, they want to have like one endpoint. Let's say that this surf report endpoint, this fictitious endpoint where I would get surf information. Let's say that I want to make all kinds of uses out of this. So I decided to create a path parameter called beach ID, but instead of making like 10 different versions of this endpoint, I decide to just make it so that this is a parameter that can be swapped in with other parameters. And so that I have like one endpoint, but it has like 10 different possible path parameters and like 30 different query string parameters, and becomes super like configurable. Conversely, you might have developers who say, no, that's too confusing. Let's create totally separate endpoints for each of these so that like instead of this being a configurable thing, it's like /beach ID and then maybe the ID. And so you have a lot of different ones. I don't think I'm articulating really well what I'm trying to explain, so let me give an example. Actually, coming back to the box one, I think I already have this in here. Yeah, or let's go to this guy. So here, you will find sometimes developers will have a lot of different endpoints. Okay, here we go. For file object, we've got get information about the file, download the file, upload the file version. These are all different endpoints that they're passing. Sometimes when people design APIs, they have a lot of different endpoints that are all very specific. Other times in their designs, they have very few endpoints, but they have a lot more configuration options in the endpoints. And if somebody chooses the latter with lots of configuration options, you might end up with many more path parameters and other kind of query strings. Whereas if somebody chooses to create separate endpoints for everything, there might be a lot less configuration options. It's just a design thing, and to be honest, you probably won't have a lot of input as a technical writer about it. It's kind of like they decided to do it that way, and that's how it is. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Like, do you run into, I guess it's more of a design question, but just be aware that there's differences in how people think best practices are about APIs. And is it better to allow it to be super configurable or not? Yeah, where are we? Just the basic difference is before the ampersand is the path parameter, after it is the query string parameter. Just keep that in mind.
Before the question mark, right?
Sorry, did I say ampersand? Yeah, question mark. Thank you.
And typically aren't the ones that are in the path parameter mandatory, the ones in
Yes, thank you. Yeah, these would be mandatory, and you would describe this as you describe the endpoint. Yeah, I don't really know if I have any more to say about that, but all right, let's keep trekking along here. Gone through parameters. Oh, I think Yelp does a nice job in defining the parameters. I mean, you really just define these in some kind of table often, but you specify whether they're required or optional, the data type, the name, and a description. I mean, it's not rocket science here, but they just need to be defined. And you'll find that it varies tremendously from API to API how they decide to define these parameters and how they want to present it. Some people might use a definition list, some might just fail to specify the data type altogether, whether it's required. So these are things to look out for. Is it required? What's the data type? What kind of parameter is it? And then you might want to group these parameters. Like you're going to put all your path parameters in one spot or your query string parameters in another. Okay. The fourth main component is the request example. This is a sample about how you would submit the request using the endpoint. And you often show some parameters configured. And this is where curl is often used. Because curl is this language agnostic, super compact way of showing the request. This is from CallFire. And you see on the right, they have the curl example. I mean, Postman is very popular for playing around with the API, but it's hard to kind of take the input in Postman's UI and show how you make that sample request, right? It's like, because you've got parameters stored in different parts of the UI. Curl is nice because it just compresses it. But people have to know that, oh, that little h, this is a header parameter. So in this case, to your point, the person is specifying the content type. They want JSON returned. That's the content that they're accepting. The U is the username and password in this example. I think this is another type of authentication, and then the method. But different doc sites have different ways of showing this. Stripe made this 3-column design super popular. I actually am not a fan of it. I think it's a little bit busy, but people like to put code samples to the right and like more abstract information in the middle. So here, if you're reading about it, you're like, oh, pagination endpoint, kind of cool. And on the right, you're like, oh, this is how I would submit it. And you can choose between curl, .NET, Java, Python as different formats. Remember how when you made that request using AJAX, you were using the JavaScript language's way of making a request out to a web resource. And if you were building a JavaScript application, you would choose JS and probably see something similar. In fact, let's see, what is the JS? I'm kind of curious if it's a jQuery AJAX type call or not. Example requests. Here we go, down here. Now they still just show it in curl, so I don't know what that's doing. Oh, maybe they get down here. Yeah, sorry, I'm not really familiar with this one. Part of the reason I don't like the sort of tool method where you put it on the right is because now you've got this added complexity to make the content on the right map to the content on the left. And then you get these giant spaces where there is no content, but now you've suddenly like sacrificed the width of your middle column to something that looks like a newspaper article. I just think it's a lot harder to pull off than it is if you just have things in the middle. See, here they're talking about methods, but on the right they're going to list them. Anyway, it's sort of it's a design decision, and it's beyond what I'm getting into here. Here's a request from parse. Again, they use curl. And if you put these little backslashes, it makes the curl more readable. All this means is new line break. But as the Windows users here noted, these don't work in Windows, so it's no longer copy pastable. A little bit of a problem. You might want to also use double quotes because then they're useful in Windows. But here, for some reason, the user reverted to single quotes. So, I mean, you want to make things as easily copy and pastable as possible. You also want it to be readable, so you might have some considerations. And here they do specify content type. Maybe this is more common than I've made it out to be. All right, Twitter, bare bones example. They're just like, I kind of can hardly believe that they have something so inelegant, but basically this is their request. Wait, example request. It's like they just pasted it in there, like very plain. But yeah, this will work. You know, something that shows everything. Now, with this example request, it's a little unclear, right? Are you really supposed to put and screen name equals Twitter API, or are you supposed to swap in your own like screen name? I would assume you'd swap in your own screen name, but it's not entirely clear because they haven't really formatted these like values that need configuration in some kind of other formatting to make it clear. So, you know, if it's confusing what's a generic value versus what's a value that needs customization, then I think formatting could help by coloring. Yeah. I don't know. The Twitter API has gone through a lot of evolutions, and people get very upset because they change it once people have implemented it. So maybe they've settled on this method for some reason. But yeah, you can see everything after this ampersand are going to be query string parameters, which are usually optional. And presumably everything that's within the equal sign are things that you would customize, some booleans and so forth. But yeah, there's a sample. There's so many different ways that people do it. It's kind of cool. Like with Java APIs, pretty much everybody uses a Java doc, and it all looks the same, and it's this terrible sort of format that people are just used to, and that's fine. But APIs, because they're more of an architectural style rather than a specific standardized protocol, there's more variation, and so there's more variation in documentation. Everybody, you know, they may have query parameters, they might not, they might have path parameters, they might not. And then how you document all this is custom as well. So there's a lot more sort of variation in how it's done. Here's an example from, I believe this is New York Times. No, City Grid, where they have a lot of different, yeah, here we go. A lot of different types, and so instead of giving one request example, they give 4 or 5. So this is another choice. How many requests should you show? Because you might really have a lot of different parameters that can be configured in many different ways, and so you want to show like a few different samples. But this becomes somewhat dangerous because now your sample response needs to sort of correlate with the sample request. The parameters that you're passing in the response should correspond with what you're showing in the response as well, right? So if you have 4 different request examples, you would probably need 4 different response examples, and then you're getting a lot of different code samples there, and it's becoming a little unwieldy. So this is the real challenge with the request, is that you may have 17 parameters, but you can't, most likely not all parameters will be valid together in that request. So you have to show a representative sample of, hey, these are a few common parameters, this is a common configuration, but it's not comprehensive of all the different configurations you might have. Yes?
And now that you mention it in terms of parameters being used, sometimes they're in dependencies.
Yeah.
So my challenge is trying to, write that out. Like, do you say you have to, use this parameter with that parameter, or this is only required if this. And,
yeah.
That's hard.
That is hard. Yeah, when parameters have codependencies, especially what's hard about it is that, as far as I know, in the Open API spec, the Swagger spec, when you try to define the parameters, there's no way to indicate whether a parameter is dependent on another parameter. Because yeah, the reality is that oftentimes, like some parameters, if you use them, you can't use other parameters. Or if you use like a longitude parameter, you have to use a latitude parameter too. But like, how do you specify that in the spec? You can't. So you would have to just manually describe it and put more notes. That's part.
It seems like that's an instance where some graphics would be really helpful. A flow chart or a diagram that shows the dependencies and requirements.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I do have a graphic to show later about API requests, but yeah, it could be helpful. I mean, people are used to seeing like diagrams in programming code that shows things like that, so that would be a good addition. Any other comments, questions about request examples? Okay. A lot of people ask about this, like how many languages should I show the request? I was getting into this a little bit with CallFire, but it didn't give a great example. Here's Clearbit. Right, so instead, here they've chosen to show curl, which they just call shell. But then they chose Ruby, Node, and Python. You can see how you might submit this in these other languages. Why choose these languages? Maybe their target users use these. Really, if you wanted to, you could just go ahead and use Postman and go to code and copy all of this stuff. You want a Python example? There you go. You want a PHP example? There you go. Like, you could pump these into your documentation. How worthwhile is it for users? I think people do like convenience. Obviously, if you've got a formatted code sample in Python and you're developing in Python, it's more convenient for you, right? But a lot of times these things are just automated. For example, readme.io will automatically generate the code using the same sort of auto generation that Postman has. Some developers think it makes it a lot easier to implement. Others might think this boilerplate code can easily be generated. Why are you cluttering up your docs with all these like different language samples? It's definitely more work because now you may have been confident that like, yes, my curl command works. I've tried and tested it, but now I've got to validate that the command works in Ruby, Python, and Node. That means I'd have to install all these on my system, and then how do I execute the Python command? You may have to have a sample Python app or something in order to make it work. It's a lot more involved, right, to test it. So you might, if you have got an automated process, you might feel just more comfortable that it would work. But if it's not, if it's just code that developers give you, it's going to be harder to test. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you have experiences where, yeah, Barry?
So I'm just I think I have the answer to my question. There's the reason why it doesn't really matter which language you use is because they're all generating HTML. They're all generating something that HTTP can process.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, every language has its own way of sending a request across HTTP.
I see.
It's part of the reason why usually the REST API is language agnostic, right? It doesn't matter what language you're using to make this request as long as it arrives in HTTP. And different languages, Python, Ruby, Java, have different ways of constructing this HTTP request. The curl is nice because like nobody's going to actually use curl like this in their app that I can imagine. Maybe it's used somehow, but I think it's just used as a demonstration of how to make a request. I should probably find out for sure. Maybe there's some way that you use a curl command directly in a language-based app, but I'm not really sure. At any rate,
it's just very interesting that there's this language agnosticism that's built into how all this works.
Yeah.
Because I remember, 10, 20 years ago, there was arguments about, oh no, C++ is better, this is better, that's better.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and this gets into kind of the heart of why REST APIs are somewhat accessible and why they're also less accessible. On the one hand, we've now taken the language requirements out of this, and we've got a language agnostic tool that is submitting a request and getting a response. So for somebody who doesn't know the programming language, this is suddenly easy to document, or easier to document, right? It's like, well, this is the request, these are the parameters, this is the response, done deal. But every developer is going to need to translate this into some code language. They're going to need to say, well, okay, this is fine, but now I need to figure out how this is done in Ruby. And how do I make this work in Python and Ruby? And there is where it often gets above our heads, because it's like, well, I don't know 6 different languages. What developers often do is they say, most of our users are using X language, so we're going to prepare an SDK, which is a toolkit that implements the API in a specific language. And that SDK is all very language specific. It's not language agnostic, and those are often difficult to document. Usually engineers will kind of handle that. But in some respects, the SDK that's language specific doesn't need as much documentation, because if somebody wants a Ruby SDK, we assume they know Ruby, right? So you're just kind of giving them the implementation that they should already recognize. It's not as if you have to, ramp them up on Ruby so that they can understand the code.
So my question is, this language translation function in Postman doesn't obviate the need for all those SDKs. You can't just put in Postman and choose a different language and count SDK.
You could try that, but yeah, I wouldn't. I mean, I've asked developers before. I said, how much can I trust this code? How do I know this is legit? And especially since Postman had those, remember in the curl, it stuffed its own little header tags in there. I don't have a good answer to that. I think most developers that I've worked with, they create their own SDK. They don't really auto-generate stuff. I think I've heard that developers spend more time trying to fix the auto-generated SDKs than they're worth. When we get more into the Swagger Hub later, they have a lot more ability to generate out these SDK frameworks that people need to get going in that language, and that might be helpful. But we'll tackle that in a little bit later. At any rate, if you stick with a curl example, you can't really go wrong. And if you show the parameters, it's usually, it's what people expect. It's what's often done. If you want to show the various languages, you certainly can. We talked about, one more thing. So there's this notion of an API explorer where you can try out a request. This is an example from the New York Times. This is their API. And this is kind of cool because you can see what's returned immediately. Now I don't have a key plugged in here, but over here on the right, you can see, depending upon what request I put in here, I can immediately view the results. And you'll see explorers quite frequently in different documentation as a way to experiment. And we'll talk more about that later. One final note, if you do have an explorer in there, you need to make it clear that if somebody is submitting a request in this test system, it's a real request that can possibly, you know, if it uses their API key, they might actually be creating some resource and later have to clean it up. So in your request example, make sure that if it is real, that people know about that.
And there would need to be a lot of error handling in the code too.
Yeah, like when people actually implement it, yeah, definitely, right? If you, usually in the API documentation, they wouldn't get into that. That would be more in the SDK where it's like, yeah, if you get no response or if the response doesn't contain the information, they have to figure out how they handle that. That is something to cover, usually in the SDK. Finally, the response example. Now this is where it gets even more interesting. Response example shows a sample response from the request example, but the response schema defines all possible elements in the response. This is where you can kind of separate good documentation from bad. Poor documentation will just show an example response, but remember, the request is just a sample request. Let's say you only chose to use 3 parameters and you know, it didn't return all possible content that could be returned from that endpoint. Well, the response example could also be a subset of the total number of elements returned. The schema, the response schema is like, hey, here's a map of everything that could be returned from this endpoint. And we're showing a general, you know, map of all these responses. Not everything might be in your response, but it's here. Now here's an example of this. This is an example from, let me get rid of some of this stuff on the right. SendGrid. I find that I'm constantly going to their API for good examples. So this is the post, mail, send, and so forth. And the responses. Wait. Request. Where did I show this? Maybe they've changed it since I've been here. Oh, this one just doesn't have a lot of meat here. Let me go to one that has more meat. Blocks API. Who knows? Anyway, they have the schema and then an example. Okay, this is a decent one. So this example is showing a sample response, but then the schema is defining every possible element that can be returned. And a good API doc site should define each of these response items. Maybe email is just really obvious, but maybe it's not, right? Like each of these things should have some kind of description as well as a definition of the data type that's returned, because the developer will need to know this when he or she incorporates this information into an application. If you don't know the data type, then you may not know how to process it correctly.
And I assume this is where you would specify the acceptable values, like what range of integers or what special.
Yeah, definitely. If you've got like an acceptable range, you would want to put that information in here, or like a min or max. Yeah, because coming back to your error handling, they may need to know that. Just depends what the developer needs to know.
I don't know about the rest of the people. This is the toughest thing to get from engineers. You always get the request information. Rarely do you get the response information.
Yeah.
So you spend a lot of time trying to figure out. In my experience, it may be different for other companies, but
maybe the
that's the toughest to find.
Maybe the testers can help in that, because they can test exactly what is supported and what is not. I mean, if you have a team
like that, or, yeah, can be. Sometimes you're going back and documenting after the fact, and testing is long, but, you know, I'm just saying, it's probably the hardest to get from people, in my experience.
Yeah, in this example, those last two really need more info. I mean, what are the possible reasons it says?
What are the ones that get sent back?
Right.
And what do you mean by required?
Yeah.
It has to be sent back? I mean, these are required.
It's a little,
passing in, right?
it's a little odd, huh? The responses contains a required element, yeah. But hands off for having a separation between an example and a schema. As Dora is saying here, most of the time developers, they're just going to give you a sample request and a sample response that they quickly copy and paste. It'll probably contain real data that you then have to somehow mask or fictionalize, right? I doubt they would let you know that, oh yeah, we just scraped prod for this. But knowing what's not there in the response is what you need to know, right? And this is why playing around with the API and saying, oh, what if I change this parameter and what comes back? And you might suddenly realize, oh, I'm getting a new block that I wasn't given in the sample response. And then there are different kinds of responses here too. This is a successful response. Let's see if there's another API that has, yeah. So 400 is usually when something is not found or some kind of error response. These are actually standard codes. If you look up status codes, Wikipedia, you find that these things are standard. So people should know like what a 500 is. It's quite amazing here. 200 is always the code for a good response. You know, most people know that. But you might get like different codes, and it could be important to document what those codes mean. If you ever have the, what is it? There's the marijuana code in here somewhere. The 420, yes. Right. The 420, thank you.
I'm a teapot.
That was a code in some, no, there was I swear it used to be in here. There was a sample API that had a 420 code. And it was like, I think Twitter has a 420 code. Oh, they deprecated it? Okay. But anyway, yeah, trying to figure out how many different types of responses your API has is challenging. This is also information you probably won't get from the developers, but you might get from testers. Beyond the 500 service error, you know, what more descriptive information could you provide? If you want to go head and shoulders into the realm of really good documentation, you document all the different status codes that can be returned and then descriptive reasons about why that status code was triggered and how to resolve it, right? It's usually more than most people ever do, but at least with a 400 you could say, or 401 or 400, whatever, you could provide some reasons like, oh, you get this code, it's because you probably put the wrong like data type for something, I don't know.
Do you find that in a schema, if you're listing those example responses, it seems like that they might be repeated across responses for different endpoints, for different requests?
Yeah, yeah.
So when we're
definitely.
Like if there's a field or message, you might have field and message in a lot of the response schema examples, right?
Yeah. So how do you kind of avoid manual copy paste and duplication?
Yeah.
This is where I think, as far as reference documentation, nothing beats using the Open API spec, because you can. I will talk more about this later. The Open API is the official name for Swagger. Most people know it as Swagger, but it's really the Open API. The Open API allows you to store common elements in a component section that then you can reuse in different ways. So here you would put a 400 response. You might have, if you have 100 endpoints and they all have the same 400 response with the same information, you wouldn't need to have 100 instances. You just refer to that same definition in the components part of your Open API. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the Open API approach, and I think that's what we're getting into next, but this is, not everybody uses that.
And we're using that to document.
Yeah. I mean, I covered these 5 examples, and here I have in my course I kind of have this fictitious surf report endpoint, and I go through each of these different sections and say, here's what it might look like, and here's the end result, right? You've got some kind of description, a listing of the endpoint. This one happens to have a path parameter. Here's my parameters. The path parameters are in its own table. The query string parameters are in their own table. I've defined which are required and optional. Since it's a table, there's always going to be formatting issues, as you can see here. Sometimes people give examples and so forth. I have a sample request shown in curl, sample response for this, and then a response definition, or the schema defined. One thing you'll find that's tricky about the response definitions is showing nested hierarchies. For example, day, time, tide. Different conventions, people have created different approaches for this. It's a challenge, right? At any rate, here I've just decided to make the muted so that I'm emphasizing which part of the response I'm showing. I've got the definitions and the data types and so forth. Here I've got really elaborate fictionalized definitions that I've got for each of these. And that's pretty much it. That's what your standard reference API endpoint documentation looks like. It's got these 5 sections: description, endpoints and methods, parameters, sample requests, sample response, and definitions. The Open API is going to make it a lot easier to sort of go through each of those sections, but you could also do it manually. You could develop your own templates for these. You might have a very custom API that doesn't fit well in the Swagger Open API model, but this is what people are looking for in documentation. And if you don't have some of these, like if you don't have a sample request, then it's incomplete. And I actually once was working on an API. I was actually editing somebody's API documentation for this team that decided to omit the requests. I'm like, you can't have API documentation without the sample requests. And they're like, well, you know, sorry, but if we do put the request in here, it will actually create a bunch of orders that will be real, and we can't have that. And I was like, what? So this was a Dash product where you can like reorder things, you know, automatically. And so apparently when they developed the code, they didn't have any kind of way to put test data. So when you made the request, it reordered your vacuum bags or your batteries or something. And even when they did finally add a flag for making it a test, it still gave you like sample order confirmations that were very suspiciously real looking. Anyway, so my point is just make sure that it's got these 5 things, review them for all the different aspects that I indicated, the data types, required, min, max, you know, realistic information. And that's really at the core of the reference documentation. Okay, I've been chatting for a while, and I think we were moving on to an activity. Yes, okay. So if we come back into workshop activities, we're in 3A. Evaluate API ref docs to identify core elements. So in this activity, I want you to try to identify these different elements in some API documentation, API doc sites. You can use doc sites at your work if you have like APIs at your work, or you can choose some from this big list here. I have this survey of 100 or not really a survey, just a big list of about 100 API doc sites. So you can choose maybe, how many did I say? 3? Yeah, 3 documentation sites. Choose 3 and see if you can, well, first of all, look for the reference documentation. You might have to hunt around the list of endpoints, whatever they decide to call them, and see if you can identify these 5 sections in it, all right? With each section, try to ask the following questions. With the resource, is the description action-oriented? You know, 'cause people are doing things with this. Is it brief, like a 1 to 3 sentence summary? With the endpoints and methods, how are they grouped? Are they listed all on the same page? Are they broken out on different pages? Are they grouped by method? or by resource. And how are the methods specified for each endpoint? They just put it on the left, or what do they do? The parameters ask how many types of parameters are there? Are there header, path, query string, and request body parameters for the endpoints? And are the data types, string, Boolean, etc., are they defined for each? They put in min, max values. For the request example, what language are they showing it in? Is it curl or is it language specific? How many parameters do they include in the sample request? And then finally, in the response example, is there both a sample response and like response definitions or schema? Is each element in the response actually defined? And then how do they handle these nested hierarchies in the response? How do they decide to display that? So I give you about 10 minutes to go through this. I don't really have a sharing component after this, but if you want, you can indicate what you found. So anyway, this is 11:10 right now, so about 11:20, 21, we'll pick back up. Sound good? And if you want to get a drink or something, feel free.